Good afternoon, everybody. This is Eleni Pelican, and I want to thank you for joining us for the U.S. Department of Energy webinar on residential PACE today. Next slide. So, as I said, my name is Eleni Pelican. I'm a policy advisor with the Weatherization and Intergovernmental Program here at the U.S. Department of Energy. We have some great speakers here today. We'd like to welcome today Kristen Sturwalt-Huff, who is a credit policy specialist, joining us from the Federal Housing Administration. And she, we'd like to thank her for joining us today and giving us an overview of the recent FHA announcement on residential PACE. As well as Kristen, we have my colleague Steve Dunn from the Building Technologies Office, and he will be talking about the recently released draft guidelines on best practices for residential PACE. Next slide. So before we begin, I just wanted to go over what we would be talking about. First, we'll be talking about, I'll give you an overview of the Department of Energy and the technical assistance we provide to state and local governments. And then, just to give us a sense of context and history, we'll go over PACE and residential PACE to date. And finally, we'll drill down into the August 19th announcements, both from FHA and DOE. And we have some time for questions today. And I'd like to speak to logistics for a moment before we begin. First of all slides will be made available after the webinar. It is being recorded as well, so a recording of the webinar will be available at the Department of Energy State and Local Solution Center. Regarding questions, you see if you look to your toolbar on your right, there is a question box. Please feel free, everybody, the participants are on mute. We will be taking questions through our question box. Once we have our presentations, please feel free to go ahead and type in your questions as we go, just to make sure that you don't forget them. And also, so we don't have all of our questions coming at once. It'll give me an opportunity to go through them and parse them out to our presenters. So that was a little bit on logistics. As I said, this is part of the technical assistance we provide to the state and local governments. We have resources, primarily our State and Local Solution Center, where we post a number of our publications, webinars, and other resources. Next slide. A little bit more about the technical assistance. What you'll find there, you'll find targeted opportunities for impact, key resources, and other information on renewable power, sustainable transportation, and energy savings homes, buildings, and manufacturing from across the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy here at the Department of Energy. Next slide. So as I stated in the beginning, this webinar is about residential PACE, which is distinct from commercial PACE. Residential PACE is financing a mechanism that allows homeowners to make clean energy upgrades to their home and pay the loan of that improvement over the course of a term over the through a tax assessment on their home. Residential PACE is active in 6 states. There have been a number of residential PACE projects completed, over 100,000. With as we expect residential PACE to continue to move forward in multiple jurisdictions. Next slide. Just a little bit another graphic on PACE. and how it works. In a state with enabling legislation, city or county would create a financing district or a special assessment district in their jurisdiction. The property owners would then sign up for the financing, and after receiving loans, the property owner would repay the financing through the property tax bill. And that would then, upon sale of the property, the loan would stay with the home and not with the original resident. Next slide. So we have had some recent and exciting announcements on residential PACE. So before we dig into to that section, I wanted to give a little bit of a historical context. PACE is a relatively new mechanism. The first PACE program was only implemented in 2008 in Berkeley, California, and after that it began to, other jurisdictions began to implement the program. As you can see, there was activity in 2009, 2010 in support of PACE. However, in July of 2010, the Federal Housing Finance Authority determined or stated that mortgages that had PACE loans attached would not be sold onto they would not purchase them on the secondary market. And at that point, the many residential PACE programs didn't move forward. However, at that time, commercial PACE began to grow for the commercial building industry. So there continued, next slide please. Over the next few years, there did continue to be policy initiatives on residential PACE, and it did move forward primarily in California, where they expanded their residential PACE program and created a $10 million loan loss reserve fund to support that program. Then in August of 2015, the White House and FHA announced that there would be new guidance to remove existing barriers and accelerate the use of PACE. And then finally, this past month, the guidance came out, guidelines came out from DOE on August 19th, announcing through a mortgagee letter from FHA what that guidance would, giving more shape to that guidance. And so I think we're going to now dive in a little bit. I'm going to actually pass over to, I believe, Steve is going to speak next on the DOE guidelines. So Steve, I'm going to pass it over to you, if that's possible. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Eleni, and thanks everyone for joining today. And we're pleased to speak with you about our draft guidelines for residential PACE financing programs. These were released on July 19th as part of the White House announcement of the Clean Energy Savings for All initiative. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking today about a little bit of background on residential PACE purpose and goals, an overview of the revised best practice guidelines for residential PACE programs. We're going to talk about some of the additions and content updates that we made, particularly in areas for consumer and lender protection, for program design, and as well as some of the information resources we've developed for states and localities, as well as for real estate professionals, appraisers, and others that are involved in the process of home improvements associated with PACE financing. And then we'll talk a little bit about, in the summary of some of our next steps, and we'll have some opportunity for Q&A as well. These are, next slide please. So again, these are draft guidelines, and we'll talk a bit about the, we have these out for comment, so we're interested in your input and feedback as to help us shape these just to be as effective as possible as a resource for states and localities and PACE program administrators. So just to back up just for a moment, and as we think about residential PACE financing, whether if you're approaching this from the perspective of a state or a local official, perhaps as a contractor working in the industry or in the financing community, there's kind of three areas of benefit that we look at as goals and objectives for residential PACE programs. And it certainly begins with the property owner, the homeowner, with the goal of lowering their energy costs, having a low upfront cost mechanism to finance improvements, and then associated benefits where those improvements, and some studies have shown that there may be increase in property value associated with those improvements. And then important, what we're seeing and this is particularly in some of the California programs, but having a process to vet contractors, which we'll talk about a little bit more in this presentation, and additional consumer protections so that they have confidence in that work. For businesses, benefits include that it's an efficient mechanism to fund improvements. PACE is fast, it's flexible. It's, for property owners that have adequate equity in their property, it can be a solution that a contractor can incorporate immediately into as they're developing the scope with the homeowner. PACE programs can also assist with marketing and lead generation by having IT infrastructure and platforms that have information for where homeowners can find contractors, and that contractor has already gone through some vetting in terms of their licensing and so forth. And then finally, potential for larger work scopes and increased volume and revenues as work from PACE scales up. And then the third leg, if you will, is communities and environment. Very important goal of reducing GHG emissions and dependence on fossil fuels, and doing that in a way that can be done at scale. And then job creation and economic development, and increased property values that may be associated with PACE transactions. What's important to keep in mind, though, and I think as context for our guidance, is that the programs, in order to deliver these benefits to property owners, contractors, and communities, have to be well designed. And so we want to make sure that programs are following best practices, that they're learning from and incorporating some of the lessons learned from early PACE program adoption in some states, and so that when the programs are implemented, that they're delivering the full range of benefits in a way that's supportive of each of these stakeholders. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the next few minutes, I'm going to give a brief overview of the best practice guidelines. They are on our website. State and Local Solutions Center will provide the link to that, so you can read them in detail. Today, I'm just going to be highlighting some of the updates and areas that we're interested in input and feedback on from stakeholders. So again, the guidelines were released on July 19th. This was an update to guidelines that were initially issued in May of 2010. So it's been several years since the first set of guidelines was issued. We have structured this update to reflect what we feel is the evolving structure of the PACE market and incorporate lessons learned from active PACE programs. We've included best practices for program design, particularly around consumer and lender protections. there's quite a bit of detail that's been added in each of those areas, and we'll talk about those. We've included some new information resources for appraisers and real estate professionals on valuation of energy-related improvements. That's another important topic. An area of interest is both documenting the improvements and then facilitating real estate transactions involving properties with PACE assessments associated. And then we've included recommendations along with some information resources and tools for data collection and evaluation of PACE financing programs, including their cost effectiveness, energy savings, as well as non-energy savings benefits that may include comfort, health, safety, and so forth. Next slide, please. So with the revised guidelines, the updates we're going to be discussing today include eligible measures and the property owner eligibility, consumer and lender protections, quality assurance, real estate transactions and appraisals, data collection and evaluation, and then DOE tools and resources. Next slide, please. So eligible measures and property owner eligibility, and this is really kind of the foundation for where PACE programs start in their with the homeowner's experience or interaction with the PACE financing program, and that begins with establishing criteria for the eligible improvements, and those that are consistent with the public purpose of the programs. And we've left that language in our guidelines deliberately broad, as those goals are defined by individual states and localities. So programs in California and other Western states, for example, might include seismic retrofits or as eligible measures, whereas in other states, wind resistance might be more of a concern. And so we've allowed some flexibility to include health and safety measures, both necessary to install efficiency measures as well as that may be associated with the structural resilience. But the key is that for any improvement financed with PACE, it should be tied back to a legally defined public purpose. Second is we've included suggestions in our recommendations and our guidelines to prioritize cost-effective improvements to maximize the benefits to homeowners relative to the types of measures and the energy savings that result from those. Approach that's recommended in the guidelines is to establish a list of eligible energy efficiency and renewable energy measures that's based on federal standards such as Energy Star, or in some cases could be a state-specific approved product lists. Energy assessments are recommended. They are not required in the guidelines as a way to identify cost-effective improvements. Our home energy score tool is available nationwide. That is a one type of assessment tool available that states and localities can utilize. There's also a number of utilities offer their own assessments, sometimes with local or more specialized tools, and those can also be used to help provide recommendations to the homeowner. And then finally, but very importantly, the property owner should have sufficient equity based on an accurate valuation of the property, whether that's through the assessed value, if the assessed values can be relied upon in the area, or an appraisal, and clear title. And there's more detail in the guidelines about each of these areas for eligibility. Next slide, please. So consumer and lender protections have emerged as an important topic in area of consideration for PACE programs based on the experience and over the last several years, and as programs start to see properties be sold with PACE transactions or refinanced. We've highlighted areas that are important here for on the consumer side: property owner education and disclosure. beginning with disclosures, transparent disclosures to consumers on how PACE financing works, including the terms, rates, fees, the obligation that the homeowner is entering into, and what the implications of that are. Recognizing that PACE is a little bit different than a credit card or even like a home equity loan or other types of financing a homeowner might be familiar with. That as a assessment on their property, there are some implications there that the homeowner needs to be aware of. Advantages as well, but again, it's making sure that they're fully informed about how the PACE assessment works and what their obligations are. Disclosures on the impacts of failure to pay, and then whether PACE, depending on the state and the type of assessment structure, how that may impact options to sell or refinance the property. Appropriately sizing assessment is important. This is typically established as a maximum assessment amount of the estimated property value, ranges from 10 to 20%. Again, this is kind of up to the individual states and program administrators to determine what is appropriate for their area. Documenting the PACE improvements, and we'll go into more detail on this again, but the improvements that are made, if available, the estimated costs and savings, notifying the lender so that that assessment can be folded into incorporated into the annual escrow and payment on behalf of the homeowner, and as well as to the homeowner so that they are aware of and can take advantage of available utility rebates as well as tax credits that might be available to them. And then incorporating that information in public records so that it's available through assessor data, multiple listing services, and the like. And public disclosure, by having standardized record keeping and disclosure of the PACE improvements will help parties, particularly in real estate transactions, understand and be able to efficiently incorporate that information as they're thinking about whether it's a home purchase or sale, other financing actions. Next slide, please. In the interest of time, I'm going to move fairly quickly through these because I know we do want to get to the material Kristen's going to present on the FHA guidance as well, and make sure we have time for questions. So the guidelines do go into more detail on each of these sections as well, and so this is again intended just to kind of provide a brief overview. So for property appraisals and real estate transactions, again, it's important to document those improvements so that information is available to real estate professionals and appraisers, and that they are informed about the improvements that are made. Suggested approaches include offering home energy score, both before and after the upgrades are completed. That will document the improvements and as well as the score associated with the property. And other assessment tools are available as well. Establishing a real estate advisor within the PACE program to assist with questions on PACE assessments and improvements. As part of real estate transactions, this is a way so that a real estate professional will have someone they can contact that speaks their language and can understand what their questions are and help them address any concerns that they may have. And then engaging appraisers and real estate professionals, and this might include training and workshops and education and information on how PACE works and how they can successfully complete a real estate transaction involving a PACE assessment. Next slide, please. Quality assurance, data collection, and evaluation. This is an important topic. This involves both the oversight of the contractor as well as the data that's being collected by the program. And I'm focusing here on mainly on some of the key data for PACE programs to consider as they're administering the program. That includes the installed measures, the PACE assessment amount, information on whether the the homeowner has had prior defaults and foreclosures. And if possible, a very important item to be able to capture if at the point the PACE assessment is made is authorization to access pre and post energy bills, energy consumption data for that property. Without that authorization, it's difficult, in some cases impossible, to go back and and collect that data at a high volume level. I didn't include on this slide, just to interest of time, but on for quality assurance and oversight of contractors, we recommend minimum certifications for and establishing a registry of approved contractors, and that work should follow industry practices and guidelines. So at a minimum, those contractors should be licensed under the state's or local jurisdictions' licensing requirements, and then follow industry standards for the work that they're performing. We do have available what we call our standard work specifications, which go into quite a bit of detail on how to properly install measures such as insulation, or air sealing, heating and cooling systems, windows, and the like. So those are available. They are mentioned in the guidelines as a resource. And then monitoring the performance of the contractors and having a dispute resolution process that could, so that if there are homeowners that are not satisfied with the work, there's a process to remedy that, and that's mediated by the program. And then finally, we do recommend on-site inspection of a percentage of the properties as a QA mechanism. Next slide, please. So DOE resources for states and localities. We have included links in this slide, and these are included in our guidelines as well. State and local solution centers, where you'll find the PACE guidelines, as well as information on designing financing programs overall as part of implementation of a clean energy program. There are reports, webinars, case studies, additional financing resources that are helpful as you think about how to develop and offer a financing program. And I think that those are as pertinent to PACE as they are other financing mechanisms such as on-bill and unsecured that you may be familiar with. The Better Buildings Residential Program Solutions Center is devoted specifically to residential energy efficiency programs. It's structured as a step-by-step guide to how do you plan, operate, and evaluate residential efficiency programs. And there is a section that is devoted to financing. We do have some resources on PACE in the Solution Center. We'll be continuing to add resources as we continue to place emphasis on technical assistance to states and communities on PACE program design. And then finally, Home Energy Score helps homeowners, home buyers understand how much energy a home, is using, and suggestions for improving its energy efficiency on a 1 to 10 scale. And Joan Glickman is the program manager for Home Energy Score. If you want more information about that, I'd be happy to connect you with Joan. Next slide, please. Resources for real estate professionals and appraisers. So we have developed, we have some partnerships that we've developed, particularly the Better Buildings Home Energy Information Accelerator that is working with organizations both nationally and locally to incorporate energy efficiency information into residential real estate transactions. That work is focusing on how to get information into MLS systems and the process and for documenting energy efficiency improvements as part of appraisals and then in real estate transactions. DOE has developed a white paper capturing energy efficiency in residential real estate transactions, steps that energy efficiency programs can take, and this looks at both the barriers as well as the opportunities to include in energy efficiency as part of a real estate transactions and some of the resources available to support that valuation. And then we also have partnerships with the appraisal industry that are offering resources for appraisers, and that includes the Appraisal Foundation, which has developed valuation advisories for green and high-performance residential buildings, and the Appraisal Institute, which you may be familiar with. It is, delivers training and education. They've developed a residential green addendum, for example, and have additional resources that are focused on energy efficiency in the appraisal process. Next slide, please. So to sum up, the residential PACE guidelines, again, are posted on the DOE State and Local Solutions Center at the link shown on the slide. The comments are being accepted through next Friday, August 19th. There's information on the website to submit comments. For the future, we are planning to offer, develop additional resources and provide technical assistance to support PACE program design and adoption, including online workshops, peer exchange opportunities for states and localities, developing and disseminating best practices, sharing lessons learned with stakeholders, and conducting analysis of PACE programs' impacts, particularly around energy savings achieved through PACE finance improvements, and as well as program design options. So the guidelines, our contact information is provided here. So please get in touch with us with your questions, feedback. We do strongly encourage both current and prospective residential PACE financing programs to follow the DOE guidelines. We are interested in input and feedback on where, if you think there may be areas for improvement or further information or resources that would help support effective program design and implementation for states and local governments that are interested in utilizing residential PACE as a financing tool. So, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And I would like to see if we have cleared up our technical difficulties. If I can hear Kristen on the line?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you so much. And I will hand this off to you. I will also mention, for anybody who joined late, we're going to be doing questions at the end, but please feel free to type in your questions in the question box so we can make sure we get that out to our speakers today. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Kristen.
Great. Thank you. My name is Kristen Stierwalt-Hess, and I'm also here with my team, Phil Caulfield and Bobby Borland. Today I plan to talk a little bit about FHA, the PACE policy, and the specific requirements of the Mortgagee Letter that was recently released. The Federal Housing Administration, or FHA as it is commonly known, insures loans that are made by FHA-approved lenders. FHA develops the requirements that must be met for a mortgage to be eligible for FHA-insured financing, and lenders determine the types of loans they make according to a variety of factors, including their risk profile, demand, origination costs, and servicing costs, and a variety of other factors. It is important to note that FHA does not directly lend to borrowers. We set the policy that the lenders use, and they make the loans. On July 19th, we published our PACE policy. I'm on slide 4. I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you to skip ahead. This policy is about FHA insurance on new mortgages for single-family homes with PACE obligations. This policy gives future home buyers the option to use FHA-insured financing when purchasing or refinancing a home with an existing PACE obligation that meets FHA's requirements. I want to be clear that FHA is not insuring the PACE obligation, but we are providing specific eligibility requirements and other policies for FHA insurance on new mortgages where the property has an outstanding PACE obligation. The policy also does not affect current FHA mortgages to properties that have PACE obligations. Now I'm going to walk you through the mortgagee letter that goes into more of the details of our PACE policy. Slide 5. PACE obligations. FHA's PACE guidance addresses the most prevalent PACE program structures, such as those in California, where the PACE assessment is treated like a property tax. Overall, this is the essence of our policy. Under FHA guidance, state laws that treat PACE obligations like taxes, like property taxes, will be eligible for FHA financing. This means a PACE obligation must be collected in the same manner as a tax. Under this policy, like all of our other policies, the lenders must determine compliance with the policy requirements. Next slide, enforceable claim. So under this policy, the property may only become subject to an enforceable claim or a lien that is superior to the FHA insured mortgage for delinquent, regularly scheduled PACE special assessment payments. In other words, the property cannot be subject to an enforceable claim superior to the FHA insured mortgage for the full outstanding PACE obligation at any time. In addition, in the event of default, acceleration of the full obligation is not permitted. A notice of lien for the full PACE obligation may be recorded in the land records as long as the property is not subject to an enforceable claim greater than the amount of a delinquency. Next slide, free assumability. Under this requirement, the lender must confirm that there are no terms or conditions that limit the FHA's borrower's right to transfer the property to a new homeowner. The PACE obligation, for example, there can be no limitations on their ability to transfer the property. They should not need to ask for permission from anyone to sell the property. And this is also a requirement that applies to all FHA loans. It's also important to note that the PACE obligation transfers to the next owner in the event of a sale, including a foreclosure sale. The PACE obligation will transfer to the next borrower. Slide 8, public disclosure. As Steve mentioned in the best practices discussion, public disclosure is critical to this market moving forward. And with respect to this particular policy, the existence of the PACE obligation on a property must be readily apparent to lenders, appraisers, borrowers, and other parties through public records. The records must show the obligation amount, expiration date, and the cause of the expiration date. And default cannot accelerate the expiration date, as I mentioned, as I just mentioned. We have not put specific requirements about what the public records are because we recognize that there is a wide variety of PACE programs, and as the market is moving to standardize itself, we want to leave some flexibility for lenders to determine which public records they use to validate the existence of a PACE obligation. Property sale, the next slide. As I mentioned, the PACE obligation transfers to the next owner in the event of a sale, including a foreclosure sale, and the new homeowner becomes responsible for the payments on the outstanding payment amount. Next slide, disclosure of the PACE obligation. So if the PACE obligation remains with the property during a sale transaction, during a property sales transaction, the property sales contract must indicate whether or not the PACE obligation will remain with the property. And in the case where it will remain with the property, it needs to disclose all of the terms and conditions of the PACE obligation to the borrower. It must be made a part of the sales contract between the seller and the borrower. If the seller is going to pay off the PACE obligation either before closing or at closing, that also should be noted in the sales contract. We want to make sure that consumers are fully informed about the status and existence of the PACE obligation, and we think that including it in the sales contract will ensure that they know about it before the transaction is consummated. Appraisal requirements, that should be the next slide. So the other implication of the PACE obligation, of a property having a PACE obligation, is that it requires a couple of additional steps during the appraisal process. The appraiser must analyze and report the impact on the value of the property. Let me just rephrase that. The appraiser must analyze and report on the impact of the PACE-related improvements and the PACE special assessment on the value of the property. So just in terms of the appraisal process, appraisers are to use due diligence in determining whether the PACE assessment is attached to the property. The appraiser is required to be geographically competent. For example, recognizing higher than typical taxes would be a function of geographic competence. Appraisers, as with all appraisal inspections, must be competent to perform this type of appraisal, and special training and experience may be necessary to properly value energy-related improvements. Appraisers are to analyze and assess the contributory value to the energy efficient components. In addition, appraisers are to determine whether or not the PACE obligation has a positive impact, a negative impact, or no impact on the market value. And finally, appraisers are to report the findings. Next slide, other requirements. Just a couple other things to note. This policy does not apply to home equity conversion mortgages, otherwise known as HECM or reverse mortgages, or Title I loans. The effective date of the policy is September 19th, 2016, but lenders can use the policy now if they would like to. In addition, a couple of things I didn't mention When the lender is underwriting the loan, they will take the PACE obligation into consideration when they determine it'll be included in the principal, interest, taxes, and insurance payment, ensuring that the borrower has the ability to pay. And it will also be included in their escrow. So each month the PACE obligation would be escrow with the property taxes and all of the other required payments. Next slide, additional resources. A copy of the Mortgagee Letter is available on our website. I understand that this presentation will be available, so you should be able to click on the link. And if you can't, if you just Google or use some other search engine for Mortgagee Letter 2016-11, the PACE Mortgagee Letter should come up. The PACE Mortgagee Letter also has attachments, which are our handbook change pages, and they go into more detail on the specific policy aspects. There are also PACE frequently asked questions, which are targeted at lenders and consumers. And if you have questions after this call, we recommend that you send them to the FHA Resource Center so that we can look at the answer and make sure that we're providing a standardized answer and that it's consistent with everything else. And it also allows us to understand what questions the market has. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Eleni.
Thanks, Kristen. That was great. We have a number of questions that have come in. Kristen, I'm going to give you the first one. Has FHFA reversed its position on its treatment of homes with PACE property assessments?
Well, since we are the Federal Housing Administration and we're different from FHFA, which is a completely separate entity, we can't speak to what their policy is. I think that if you look in the press, they've been pretty clear about what their position is, but as FHA, we would not speak to their position.
So our FHA is different than FHFA.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say it gets kind of confusing with the acronyms. We are the Federal Housing Administration, and we are a part of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. FHFA is the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and they are charged with overseeing or providing oversight of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
Great. Another question. Under the FHA guidance, does the PACE lien need to be subordinated to the mortgage?
Phil Caulfield is going to address that question.
As Kristen indicated in her presentation, where there can only be a lien for any unpaid delinquency. So there can't be a lien for the full PACE obligation if the property is going to be eligible for FHA.
Okay, and Steve, I'm gonna pull you in here. One question about residential and commercial PACE. Do you know if it can be used for new as well as existing construction?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it depends on the requirements of the PACE program and whether the property would be eligible or not. PACE financing in general is designed for existing buildings, existing homes, and existing commercial buildings. That if the property meets the qualification requirements in terms of having adequate equity and title and so forth, in terms of the PACE program, it could be eligible. The property owner would have to check with the with their lender and the program where that property is located to determine whether it would be eligible for PACE financing.
Great. And we've gotten a lot of questions about, in different forms, about consumer protections. You know, what will protect the homeowner from maybe an oversized system, too much insulation. Steve, could you talk for a minute about maybe what is going on, what we know, and what is going on in the industry in terms of consumer protections?
Sure. Yes, important topic, and there are efforts underway within PACE programs in California where there have been a set of statewide guidelines around consumer protection that have been developed and that are being applied by individual PACE programs. PACE Nation has also developed a detailed set of consumer protection standards that programs can refer to. The consumer protections can include, you know, additional steps for working with contractors to ensure that those contractors are adequately vetted and that there's some oversight, active oversight of the contractors, that that they're doing quality work, and that if there is an issue that comes up with inevitably with when working with contractors on home improvement projects, there's things that may not go as planned, or issues come up, and so having a conflict resolution process in place is one way to address those concerns. In the guidelines, we've suggested some additional steps that can be taken around the PACE financing, which Kristen also covered, and some of that's incorporated into the FHA guidance to provide disclosure of the PACE terms and fees, interest rates to consumers, and that there is some ongoing support for where there may be interest in either refinancing the property or as part of real estate transactions.
Yeah, and I think we also want to mention the information. I don't think usually this is one of the first things we mention, but the information available on PACE Nation in terms of the programs that are established in residential PACE, as well as the authorities who are working in this area, and what they're doing as an industry to establish consumer protections.
Mm-hmm.
Another question. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll also mention that you know, as part of our work with residential efficiency programs through Home Performance with Energy Star, tools like Home Energy Score, and our standard work specifications, we have a number of resources and partnerships that are available to contractors, to PACE programs, that can help them as they to design an effective program that's going to achieve energy savings in a way that's cost effective for consumers.
And another question for you, Steve. We've gotten some questions about where the 6 states are that have residential PACE, and also if you could speak to the loan loss reserve in California that I mentioned in the beginning. What is the purpose of that?
Sure. So maybe starting with the loan loss reserve, the purpose of the reserve was, as I understand it, was established by the state of California through an agency called CAPTA, which I won't spell right now, but is essentially was to provide a reserve fund for PACE assessments that may be due in the event of foreclosure. My understanding is that there has not been any call for making claims on that $10 million reserve. And other states have also established a similar reserve fund, in some cases to attract more favorable terms for bond financing, as well as to provide some protection to lenders in the event of assessments from PACE assessments being due during a foreclosure. States that have PACE programs active, and these are, California is where the majority of activity has been, but other states that have enacted PACE include Vermont in the New England region, Florida, Missouri, with programs in the St. Louis area and Jefferson City, New York with some local programs, Long Island Green Homes is one example, and then two states, Nebraska and Rhode Island, have recently enacted PACE legislation, and there are many other states that are in the process of either have some form of PACE legislation that may allow residential PACE, perhaps with some adjustments, or in some cases PACE is already allowed under statute, or considering adopting PACE.
Great. So a question for our friends from FHA. The guidance notes that the delinquent PACE payments will fall to the servicer, not FHA. But is there any case in which the servicer's back payments of delinquent PACE assessments would be insured by FHA's Mutual Mortgage Insurance Fund, or MMIF?
Yeah, just to be a little clear here, FHA, as Kristen mentioned, always requires that all tax payments be escrowed. In the event of the borrower defaults on the FHA-insured mortgage, we require the servicing lender to advance those payments to keep not just the PACE, but all the real estate tax and insurance accounts current. In the event the property does go into foreclosure and FHA eventually pays a claim, we would then reimburse the lender back for all those advanced payments we made. The PACE obligation does fall into delinquency. I mean, we did assess the impact of PACE on the mutual insurance fund, and it was determined that there wouldn't be any impact on the fund, and that's why we in fact have issued this guidance, because there won't be an impact on the fund.
Great. Good. A question about state and local community technical assistance. How can, if state and local communities are interested, how can they access the technical assistance? I think there are going to be a number of opportunities of technical assistance that are going to be broad, such as webinars that will be able to present expertise and analysis, and then more targeted technical assistance. We are still working on a process for that. This is a new area for us, and we're going to be working with state and local communities, hopefully, as they work through their issues on residential PACE. Anything you would add to that, Steve?
No, we do have some work we're planning to again to analyze PACE program impacts, and that'll be work we're planning for the next year, and so we'll be in touch with states and organizations interested.
An interesting question on minimum loan amounts. We don't know, maybe each, I think, residential PACE program may be different, again, as it's implemented in its state or jurisdiction. But Steve, do you know anything about the size of PACE loans, if there are generally minimum amounts, maximum amounts?
The minimum amounts are set by the individual programs, so it does vary by state and program. I believe in California it's $5,000, but again, that does vary by the type of program. There is a fair amount of work involved in establishing a PACE assessment and recording it on the property with the local assessor, and so it's typically used for larger projects rather than a single project like a water heater, for example, that may be too small for a PACE assessment. I do know that the state of California, CATFA, does publish on their website information on PACE program activity, including the median assessment amount. So that information can be obtained, at least for the California programs there.
I think that also I'll add that, we're getting a lot of questions about things that are specific to what has happened in the past in terms of has a PACE assessment been sold, has a mortgage with a PACE assessment been sold on the secondary markets, and would a homeowner, has a PACE transferring from to a new homeowner been a problem in the past? And I think these are specific to programs that have existed at the jurisdictional level, and we will be looking more closely at those to help state and local governments understand details as they stand up their programs. But I think right now we are still at the state and local level, not necessarily the details of every PACE exchange that has happened. But as we move forward on providing more information on residential PACE, I think we will be able to address those issues more holistically. So we still have a lot of questions. Let's see. Again, very specific to, let's see, have FHA loans been sold on the secondary markets with, I think, a PACE loan? I'm not sure that we know that information. Steve, Kristen, any information there?
From FHA's perspective, I would say that we don't know that any FHA loans have been sold on the secondary market with the PACE obligation, which is one of the reasons why we put in the disclosure requirement in our policy.
Mm-hmm. Steve, in terms of appraisals, is there an enforcement on the appraiser requirements?
I think that you may want to, I mean, Kristen should probably respond to that. I know there were some other questions about the capabilities of appraisers, and again, we are involved with working with the appraisal industry on developing education and training resources as well as guidance to help appraisers as they document the improvements. But Kristen, do you want to take that specific question about the appraisal requirement?
Yeah, I'm going to let Bobby Borland, our valuation expert, handle that.
So we would not have any other any differences in our monitoring process than we do now, and we do review appraisals regularly. So there wouldn't be necessarily any additional requirements other than our normal appraisal process.
Okay, and so one area that I think we've seen where PACE programs can help facilitate that process is, again, as we covered in the slides, is to document the types of improvements made and incorporate that information into the assessor records as well as the real estate records. so that when the appraisers are looking for that, it's they can quickly find it. And back to you, Elaine.
Yeah, so I think we have a question. As Steve mentioned, our DOE guidelines are still in draft form, and we are still taking comments. And I think we have a question here about our recommended approach, which I think is may want to be submitted ultimately in written form through the website that Steve mentioned as a comment on our guidelines. But the question was regarding the recommended approach related to eligible measures, using only ENERGY STAR or similarly rated equipment. Would that be sufficient for approving a project, or must, as the guidance states, the finance package of energy improvements be designed to pay for itself over the term of the assessment?
Yeah, so we recommend that PACE programs prioritize measures that are cost-effective over the life of the assessment, so that the savings from the measures offset the assessment. One way to approach that is to utilize information on measures that are cost-effective. And ENERGY STAR, those products are researched, and those standards are developed at the federal level as technologies demonstrate cost effectiveness to consumers. Utility programs at the state and municipal level also develop and identify cost-effective measures, and so that would be another way to identify those measures and determine eligibility. But the approach that at least in PACE programs in California have taken is to develop lists of recommended eligible measures. Again, we recommend that programs focus on measures that are cost-effective over the term of the assessment. We've left that language somewhat flexible because we also recognize that there are sometimes there are health and safety issues in the home. There are other could be more resilience-related objectives. There are homeowners that may be interested in water conservation, for example, in drought-stricken communities, where that may not necessarily be reflected in the necessarily in the cost effectiveness of the energy efficiency measure, but overall would have benefit to the property owner.
Great. So somebody brought up Vermont and Maine's program and how they're actually not collected by the municipalities. They're collected by and enforced by the banks that are contracted by the PACE programs. The question is, these wouldn't qualify under the PACE guidelines. Is that correct? I was wondering if you, Steve, if you want to answer that question, and also talk a little bit about maybe the role of the guidelines in terms of what we are trying to do and what we are not trying to do. Regarding that, and I don't know if maybe Kristen would also like to, or FHA would also like to talk about if a program is not collected by a tax assessment, if there's any effect on an FHA loan there, an
Sure.
FHA insured loan, I should say.
Right. Yeah, so there are a lot of ways that states and localities can approach the use of PACE as an assessment mechanism, as a mechanism to finance energy efficiency improvements. And Maine and Vermont have taken their own somewhat unique approaches. Both do, if I understand correctly, involve the municipality that records the assessment on the property, and permits transfer of the assessment to the next owner, so that aspect of PACE is retained in their programs. They are structured, at least in Maine, the program is structured where it's the municipality plays less of a role, and the bank is involved in the financing and collecting the assessment. So the guidelines that we've developed, I think, are still applicable to a range of PACE program designs around establishing eligibility of the measures, having oversight of contractors, incorporating energy assessment tools where appropriate to help guide the projects. And Kristen can speak to how programs like in Vermont, how those relate to FHA's guidance.
So we haven't actually evaluated those types of programs on just a general level, and I think the way the guidance is written, it would be up to the lender to determine whether or not the PACE assessment complied with the guidelines. I think, yeah, so I think the lender would have to look at how the state treats the PACE obligation. Is it being treated as a property tax? And check all of the other requirements that are in the mortgagee letter.
Great. We have a question here about homeowner equity. We talked about limiting the assessment to 10 to 20% of the appraised value of the house. Is there any information in the guidance or the guidelines that refer to homeowner equity?
Is that referring to FHA or ours or both there?
I think let's start with you, Steve.
So I'm not sure, and just make sure if the question is related to the equity or value that the property owner has in the property. Is that or is it equity in terms of access to PACE financing as a?
I think the question is, is homeowner equity an element to be considered at any point?
Okay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that is a consideration, and programs do establish loan-to-value requirements so that the homeowner needs to have adequate equity available after the first mortgage, and any other mortgages and assessments on the property are considered. And again, those amounts vary in the level that they require. But yes, it is designed so that if the homeowner doesn't have adequate equity in the home, it would limit their ability to utilize PACE financing, and that provides another mechanism of consumer protection so that their property is, as well as lender protection, so that they're not in a position where they have excessive debt on their property.
Mm-hmm.
Kristen, is that?
So Phil's going to take that question, just to add a little bit.
Yeah, just remember, if it's an FHA loan, then it's not a lien on the property, so it's not going to affect the equity. What it will affect, because we will take into account when we're evaluating the mortgage or the billing to pay, is that extra tax assessment that's going to be in their monthly payments. So that will be taken into consideration. But the loan-to-value ratio is not going to be a factor, but it is a factor in the debt-to-income ratio.
Steve, we're getting a question about if DOE is working with national lenders on their concerns about risk. Excuse me, risk.
So we have, that's part of, in developing our revised guidelines, we've included lender protections as a section or topic that is addressed in the guidelines, along with some of the notification requirement for lenders, documenting the improvements that are made, along with the cost and savings. In terms of the types of risk, that's always a concern. I think the way that the PACE programs have evolved is, so what the industry has actively worked with communities, with homeowners, with the real estate industry, and with lenders to develop approaches that are aligned with or address the concerns of first mortgage holders, particularly around foreclosure and real estate transactions. So we have issued our guidelines as a draft for the purposes of getting input and feedback from stakeholders. So we will continue to both as we understand what the issues are, as well as approaches are for and best practices for conducting PACE in a way that it's consistent with requirements of first mortgage holders.
And again, I think it's important to note that the DOE guidelines are to be used in conjunction with the jurisdiction's needs for their constituencies. We understand that each state and local government is responding to the needs in their communities, and I think DOE, we have looked at best practices from some of the existing programs in the country, and we are trying to provide those as this program moves forward. But we want to we do this in hand in hand with the local governments and the state governments who are going to create programs that speak to their specific jurisdiction's needs. We also got a question if there were any standard recommendations for laws that a jurisdiction could pass in the legislature to enable PACE. Correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but I believe that PACE Nation has some information on states and legislation. I don't know if they have model legislative language, but they do have examples. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there is information on legislation and approaches taken in other states, and again, because PACE program designs do vary quite a bit from state to state in terms of how the assessment process works and the mechanisms for authorizing PACE as a financing program. I would say, just to add, that the guidelines and resources that we've developed can help inform as states are thinking about their program design, whether it's through statute or legislation. And again, these are drafts, so we will be once we've finalized the guidelines, they'll be available, and we expect to have that completed by end of September. But these can also be used as a guide to help understand what are some of the program design issues. Some of which a lot of states they'll leave the legislation fairly broad, and then for the specific of program design and implementation details and things like eligible measures and minimum assessment amount leave to the to the state agencies in conjunction with the PACE program administrators to develop and make those decisions.
And so as energy prices change, if there is a PACE program, or as it relates to PACE, is there anything that we can point to as a best practice in our guidelines that talks about, what it would mean if energy prices were to fluctuate and what effect that would have on loan repayment?
Well, so that's only one factor, of course. I mean, so there could be other. If a customer has a solar system, for example, installed, there's other state policies that may affect revenue from those systems. And overall, I think if an energy assessment is performed using a home energy score or similar assessment tools, that can help to provide further information on the expected revenues and or savings rather from energy efficiency and other improvements that are made to the property. So they're over. So that will, prices do fluctuate, but overall, that information would give the property owner a reasonable idea of the level of. It also is influenced, of course, by homeowner behavior and how the home is, how many occupants are in the home, and other factors. So.
Sure. Well, I want to thank you both for your presentations and for answering so many questions. We are at the end of our time now, and so I hope everybody found this webinar helpful. I do want to clarify, I did make a mistake in my presentation when I said August 19th. The announcements were made July 19th. The comments on the draft Department of Energy guidelines are due August 19th. So if you are submitting comments, please have them in at that point. And with that, I thank Steve and Kristen for your time, and I will conclude this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.